Font weight affects the perceived hierarchy of information, the readability of text, and sometimes the affordance of action. In most cases, simply changing from a regular weight font to a bold weight can be just enough to signal different meaning within that usage. You'll remember from our Instagram example that the body copy was the exact same size, the exact same color, but the profile names were made bold, and that was just enough to signal change that you could tap on it to go to someone's profile. So when you're designing interfaces, the type, as we have mentioned before, it's going to be the most critical part of the interface. So making subtle changes here and there can be sometimes be the best way to emphasize certain parts while also de-emphasizing other parts. Let's take a look at an example from an app that I designed. This app was called Zipper. So there's a handful of designs right here, but what I really want to focus on is this section over here when you're trying to invite a team member. So we want you to enter a team or a username or an email. So you tap this input field and you have this send icon, or not icon, you have the send text that is going to be active, but it's not active yet. So this is the deactive state, and you have your active cancel button over here. And then as soon as you start typing or you select someone for this example, we haven't quite selected that, but for this example, we've chosen this person, Hillary Fox. And then all of a sudden now we have this really bold send button has now active. And you can see that the weight here on cancel is regular, whereas the weight here is quite heavy. And that just kind of indicates that that is the primary action, that if you want to invite this team member, sending it is going to be your primary action, whereas cancel will be your kind of secondary. So we want that primary action to be a little bit heavier, just a little bit more weight to give it that primary action. And if you zoom out, you can kind of see the difference right here between the inactive send and the active send. Now that's a really simple example. Let's take another look at weight change on this Streamline Icons website again. So you can see on here we have a kind of a heavy hello and then welcome to Streamline. It's just kind of, in this particular case, just enough to add a little bit of visual interest. But down here in the navigation, let me zoom in a little bit so you can see this a little bit better. So we're changing the color on hover, then we're changing the weight once you tap it. And so changing the weight, the color and the weight sometimes can be just enough to give it that extra bit of emphasis that it needs when you're designing something like a navigation or some kind of like view switcher or something like that. There's also more to weight in general than just changing the font style from normal to bold or black or something like that. There's also visual weight that is created with negative space and color that can oftentimes provide a lot more total weight than with just changing the font style alone. And we'll take a look at some of those examples in just a minute. So typically on the web, you have font weights that range from anywhere from 100 to 900 according to some CSS properties. You've got your hairline weight at like 100. You've got regular weight, which is set at normal or 400. And then you've got bold at either bold or 600, or you have black that is going to be your 900 weight. Now, this is definitely specific to CSS, and not all font weights are going to be created the same way because a typographer and whoever's designing the typeface has full liberty and creative control to name those weights whatever they want. So it's going to be slightly different from typeface to typeface, but this is just good enough to give you a kind of a general idea of how the weights work within the typefaces. So a big takeaway here is that the font that you're using is going to define the weights that you have available. So if the font you're using doesn't include a variety of weights baked in, and you try to force it bold or you try to force it italics or something like that, the computer is often going to kind of generate its own version of a slanted or a slightly thicker font weight. And that's just oftentimes really going to be really bad, because when you create a bold font weight from scratch, there's a lot of little nuance that goes into all the details of the letter forms. So when you're trying to go bold with a font, don't just rely on a computer to bold it for you. make sure that you're choosing a font that has an actual bolded weight style attached with it. So that's going to be much better. It's going to look more proper and it won't look so forced and just kind of not good. So don't do that. As far as light and hairline weights go, they should mostly be avoided in user interface design. It's just really hard to read in most contexts. It starts looking like really thin and crisp and hard to read. And unless you're going to go really big, like the weather app with its big display of the temperature, in those cases when you're using like 60, 80, 100 point size font, light and hairline can be a cool option because the actual letter forms are thick enough to be visible. But if you're trying to use 16 or 18 point body copy with light or thin or hairline, it's just not going to work very well. So I would just definitely avoid that use case. So in most cases, regular, book, and medium are going to be used for body copy, whereas like semi-bold, bold, heavy, black, those are going to be more reserved for headlines. However, if you're going for like a big, thick, chunky style, that might change up the way that you use those typefaces. And sometimes you can use like a semi-bold or a bold for a body copy if that's kind of the style you're going for. And if you check out Pinterest, for example, Pinterest is a really good example of kind of using that bold font weight. So you can see like up here in the navigation, they're using like a bolder font weight. So if I go into the inspector, if I choose this navigation thing, you can see that the font weight is set to 700. So 700 is pretty bold in terms of CSS. Normally a normal font style, a normal font weight would be 400. So if I change that to 400 here, you can see that it's now turned into like a regular weight, and it definitely feels thinner and crisper, but it doesn't quite go with their brand. They kind of have this chunky, bold brand. So if I go back in and select that guy again, change it back to 700, and you can see it's a little bit thicker. And you can even experiment with this. If the font weight is available, you can even see what 800 looks like. You can see what 900 looks like. It's also affecting these right here. 900 you can see is super bold, but looks like a little bit too much. So go back to 700 here, maybe 800 again. Honestly, I kind of like the 800 for this. Another example is the Shift Nudge beta page, which you've probably already seen. I'm using this font called TT Furs Noya, or Furs New if you're not pronouncing it in the snobby typographic dialect. I'm pretty sure I'm using semi-bold for the entire thing. So font weight 600. I'm pretty sure that I only have one semi-bold font called for the entire thing, and I'm using semi-bold for every single instance of the typography here. So I just wanted it to have a thicker, kind of chunkier style, just to look a little bit unique. So if there are specific examples like that, it's totally fine to use a bolder font style, but it's not usually going to be when you're creating an app and you want this big system. Most of the time you won't use semi-bold in that way or bold in that way, but from time to time, if the situation calls for it, go for it and explore. So back to creating visual weight with techniques other than just the font style, like negative space and color. You can use negative space to your advantage to surround any particular amount of text to give it some implied weight and significance. So if you look at this example on my own personal website, I'm using, a quite large type size here and a very heavy weight for these titles, but it's also accentuated by this very large block of negative space. So if I go into one of these, same thing here. I'm using a pretty large and beefy headline, which is set to black, the boldest weight that this typeface has. But I'm also using quite a bit of negative space here, so it really kind of adds a lot to it. And you could even go in and kind of experiment here. You could change the typeface down to say 2 rems, which would be about 32 pixels, and then give it some more padding on the top and the bottom. And you can see that would be another particular style where the type size is much smaller, but it still has a pretty big impact because there's so much negative space around it. Now there's some issues. I just kind of hacked it together, but you can kind of get the idea that more negative space around a title is going to give it more impact, even if it's the smaller type size. Another example of visual weight can be found on the Flowkit website. So if you scroll down and you go to this purchase section, I wanted the purchase section to be more visually heavy. I wanted it to kind of stand out amongst everything else. So I gave it this dark blue background, and I have this, bright orange call to action and bright blue call to action. So it might get, it kind of matches the background of these other modules. If I just had like a light gray module here, it wouldn't be quite as impactful. So I have these, heavy, visually colored and weighty modules, which gives this typeface, team and solo here look much heavier than they would if they're on a white background with black copy. So they are using a bold font, but they look even heavier because I'm using a darker color for the background. You can compare it to some of these titles like this. Like this looks heavy, but it's not quite as visually impactful as these large blocks of color with reversed out text on top of it. Okay, for this last example for creating some interest and visual impact with font weight, I want to show you an example inside of Figma. So I've got this block of text that I've copied and pasted from one of my favorite books called As a Man Thinketh. So I went to Google Fonts and I searched for serif fonts, and I wanted to make sure that it had lots of weights associated with it. And just kind of scrolling through, I wanted to find something that was kind of nice and ended up on Crimson Pro here. It's got a lot of weights and it's just kind of a neat looking typeface, so I decided to give it a go. So inside of Figma, I've got this body copy and this title pasted in. It's kind of all run together. There's a title here, and there's a paragraph here and a second paragraph there. Now, inside of Figma, you can actually use all of the Google fonts without having to install them locally on your machine because it's all web-based, so that's another cool feature of Figma. So what I'm going to do here is change this to Crimson Pro. Actually, Crimson Text is what I'm going to use. I'm already at 100%, so I'm just going to bump this up to maybe 21 just so we can see it a little bit better. I'm making sure that I don't have this too wide, that I have it at a nice kind of width here. You can see that even if everything's kind of run together right now, and even if I just simply give it a line break on these two lines, that alone is giving it negative space between the title and the paragraph and another paragraph. That alone is giving more weight to each individual section. So if I go in here and I add a bold weight to the title, that is pretty nice. There's not a lot you have to do beyond that. I know that this is kind of designed in abstract form. We're not really looking at anything in particular, but if you're looking at this, it's a pretty nice body of text. And that's the thing about body copy and font weight, font style. It doesn't have to be so over the top. It can just be really nicely set, and it doesn't need to scream for attention. It can just be nice and properly set. And just like that blog post that I pulled up earlier, it can be superbly ordinary. That's a lot of what text does. It doesn't pull a lot of attention. It's just enough. It's set just enough, and it's the right size, the right spacing that you can read it, and there is emphasis where it needs to be, and there's not where it's not. So it's kind of a fine, delicate balance. But you can see all I did was add a couple of line breaks and change this heading, and that looks pretty nice. Now, you could also play with the line spacing. If I give it 135%, maybe tighten it up a bit. Maybe if I went to like 150, that could also work. 125 could probably work. It just kind of depends on, the content and the length of everything. I think I kind of like the 135%, not that. There we go. And if I wanted to go even heavier with the title, I could go here select all of that and go to these text options, and then change the letter case to all caps right here. So that being the same size and making it bold, but also making it uppercase or all caps, that gives it even more weight. Now, if this was like the main title of the page, that might make more sense. You know, you have to think about what this particular headline is doing in context of like the entire novel or whatever you're working on. So in this circumstance, I think either one of them work. And if you wanted to give it even more weight, you could give it another line break. You know, and then that alone is creating a lot of weight just because we've given it 2 line breaks, a bold font style, and uppercase. Like that's a lot of weight compared to if I go back, you know, that's definitely weightier than the body, but it's not quite as much weight. So it really just depends on what you're trying to accomplish with that headline. Both of these styles look good. It's just a matter, again, of what you're trying to accomplish and the context of what you're designing for. So for your homework on this lesson, I want you to go back to your coffee cup design from the previous lesson. And if you haven't done that, go back and watch that and do that homework first. But now, instead of using 3 or 4 different type sizes for your interface, like I asked you to do in the last lesson, now I want you to revise your existing design to just use 1 type size. And save it as a new file before you get started. I don't want you to delete your original. I want you to use 1 type size, and you can use any weight of the typeface that you want. You know, if you want to go into Google Fonts and pick something really nice that has a lot of weights, so you have a lot of different options, that's totally fine. But I want you to use 1 size and really experiment with bold, black, hairline, things like that. You might, be careful with the hairline, especially since you're using 1 type size. And I want you to create that additional weight using the negative space and some color for some of the different areas. So post your work into the Slack group, get some feedback. And again, if you're feeling up for it, post it to Dribbble, write down the parameters and the description of what you're kind of going for and tag me in it. I'd be happy to give you some feedback. So can't wait to see what you come up with on this font weight assignment.